The story opens with a sensory juxtaposition, the scent of blood and expensive cologne. This immediately establishes the duality of the male lead, luxury masking violence. How it grabs attention, it uses the hidden talent/secret identity trope. By showing Lindsay as practically invisible and then having her shatter that invisibility with a high-status defiance, speaking a secret language to an untouchable boss, the reader is immediately tethered to her safety and the mystery of her origin. The air inside the Palazzo Nero was thick with the scent of roasted espresso and the suffocating weight of silence. For 3 years, Lindsay had been a ghost in a tailored uniform, the perfect server who saw everything and said nothing. But as she stood before Sunahan's private table, the silence finally shattered. Suna didn't look up from his tablet, his thumb scrolling through figures that likely decided the fates of thousands. He dismissed her presence with a flick of his wrist, a gesture so casually demeaning it burned worse than a physical strike. "The vintage is wrong," he muttered in English, his voice cold and flat. "Take it away. And tell your manager I don't pay for incompetence." Lindsay felt a strange, cold click in her chest. The years of swallowing insults, of being treated like a piece of the gilded furniture, crested into a wave of crystalline clarity. She didn't reach for the wine. Instead, she leaned in just enough for the scent of his expensive cologne to sting her nose. "Napun seki," she whispered. The scrolling stopped. Sunu's thumb froze on the glass. The silence in the room shifted from heavy to lethal. "You think because you sit in a velvet chair in Milan, you've outrun the stench of the Busan docks," she continued, switching to a dialect so sharp and colloquial it was like a blade drawn across silk. "You're not a king, Sunu. You're just a scavenger who learned how to dress well. Your money might buy this palace, but it can't buy the rot out of your soul." Sunu slowly raised his head. His eyes weren't filled with rage, they were filled with a terrifying, predatory curiosity. He looked at her as if seeing a statue suddenly begin to bleed. The rest of the staff had gone rigid, the clink of silverware in the distance the only sound in the vacuum she had created. "A Busan blade," Sunu said softly, his voice a low vibration. "I wondered where you were hiding that edge." He didn't scream. He didn't have to. He simply looked at the floor manager, who was already rushing over, face pale with terror. Sunu held up a single finger. "Remove her," Sunu commanded, his eyes never leaving Lindsay's. "Not just from the building. From the industry. From the city. Mark her." The manager grabbed Lindsay's arm, but she shook him off, standing tall even as she felt the invisible net of Sunu's influence begin to tighten around her throat. She had broken the first rule of the Palazzo Nero: never remind the gods that they are made of clay. As she was escorted toward the service exit, she felt the weight of Sunu's gaze on her back, a mark that would follow her long after she left the marble floors behind. The black sedan didn't stay gone for long. Lindsay had barely walked 2 blocks when the screech of tires echoed through the narrow corridor of the Via Brera. Before she could duck into the shadows of a stone archway, 2 men materialized from the vehicle. They moved with a clinical, terrifying efficiency, no shouting, no struggle, just the heavy scent of chloroform and the sudden, crushing weight of a wool coat thrown over her head. When the world stopped spinning, the cold Milanese wind had been replaced by the dry, recycled air of a high-rise penthouse. Lindsay gasped, her lungs burning, as the blindfold was ripped away. She wasn't in a basement or a warehouse. She was sitting in a plush velvet armchair inside a room that felt more like a museum than a home. Floor-to-ceiling glass offered a panoramic view of the Duomo, but the internal view was far more lethal. Sunuhan sat across from her, a crystal glass of amber liquid in his hand, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You should be dead," Sunu said, his voice terrifyingly soft. "My men expected an execution order." Lindsay spat a stray hair from her mouth, her eyes defiant despite the trembling in her hands. "Then get it over with. Or did you bring me here to show off your view?" Sunu leaned forward, the light of the city catching the sharp angles of his face. "Speak again," he commanded. "In the dialect. Tell me I'm a scavenger. Tell me about the rot." Lindsay hesitated, confused by the shift in his tone. There was no rage in his eyes now, only a hollow, haunting hunger. "You're insane," she rasped in the thick, melodic tongue of the Busan coast. "You hold me captive to hear me curse you? You truly are a broken man, Sunu-han. Sunu closed his eyes, a shudder passing through his shoulders. For a moment, the predatory mask slipped. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a lost child. My grandmother, he whispered, almost to himself. She used those same sharp vowels. She was the only person who didn't look at me and see a balance sheet. When she died, that sound died with her. Until tonight, he stood up and walked toward her, stopping just inches away. He didn't reach for her throat, he reached for a strand of her hair, his fingers hovering just out of reach. The mark stays, he murmured, his obsession gleaming in the dark. But not because I want you hunted. I want you kept. You are the only living thing that sounds like home, Lindsay. And I have never been good at letting go of my property. The realization settled in her gut like lead. He didn't want her blood, he wanted her voice to fill his silence. She wasn't an enemy anymore, she was a songbird in a gilded cage. The golden luxury of the penthouse felt more like a tomb as the days bled together. Lindsay was a prisoner of sound. Sunu would summon her at odd hours, demanding she recount stories of the Busan docks or recite old folk poems, his eyes tracking the movement of her lips as if trying to catch a spirit. But while Sunu was lost in his nostalgia, his empire was still churning. On the 5th floor of the Han building, a man named Kale, Sunu's most ruthless digital architect, sat before a wall of monitors. He had been tasked with scrubbing Lindsay's digital footprint to ensure no one else could track her, but the deeper he dug, the more the data refused to align. Sir, Kale's voice crackled through the intercom in the penthouse library. I found the breach. The girl's identity isn't just a fake, it's a masterpiece. It took me 3 days to crack the encryption on her original birth records. Sunu, who had been listening to Lindsay describe the smell of the Jigalki fish market, stiffened. He gestured for Lindsay to remain silent and walked to the monitor on his mahogany desk. Go on, she isn't just some runaway server, Kale said, his voice dropping an octave. Her legal name is Minji Park. Her father was Mitchell Park. The glass in Sunu's hand didn't shatter, but his knuckles turned a ghostly white. The name Mitch Park was a curse in the Han household. He was the man who had orchestrated the hostile takeover that led to Sunu's father's disgrace and ultimate suicide. The Parks and the Hans had fought a silent, bloody war for decades until Mitchell disappeared, along with his young daughter. After a mysterious fire at their Seoul estate, Sunu turned slowly to look at Lindsay. She was standing by the window, the sunset casting a long, sharp shadow across the floor. The resemblance he had been chasing, the cadence of her voice, the stubborn set of her jaw, suddenly snapped into a terrifying new context. It wasn't just the accent of a grandmother, it was the blood of the man who had destroyed his life. You, Sunu breathed, the warmth of his obsession instantly turning into a frigid, calculated rage. You didn't just end up at Palazzo Nero by accident. Lindsay didn't flinch. She met his gaze with a terrifyingly calm smile, the mask of the submissive captive finally dropping. It took you long enough, Sunu. I've been sitting in your house, speaking your language, waiting for you to realize that the ghost of Mitch Park has been sleeping under your roof. The cage had changed. He wasn't just keeping a memory anymore, he was housing a Trojan horse. The penthouse elevators shrieked open at 3 a.m, vomiting a chaotic swirl of violence into the pristine marble foyer. Sunu stumbled in, his hand clamped over his side, blood dark and oily against his white dress shirt. Behind him, Cho was shouting into a radio, his own face splattered with glass shards from the ambush on the autostrada. Lindsay watched from the shadows of the hallway. The Titan had been brought low. The men who usually stood like statues were panicked, their medical kit spilling gauze across the floor. They were soldiers, not surgeons, and Sunu's breathing was becoming a wet, shallow rattle. Move, Lindsay commanded, her voice cutting through the noise with the authority of the Busan docks. Cho bristled, reaching for his sidearm. But Sunu groaned, his head lolling back. Let her, he wheezed. Lindsay knelt in the blood, ignoring the ruin of her silk dress. She didn't see the man who had imprisoned her, she saw a problem to be solved, a lesson from her father resurfacing in her hands. Mitchell Park had been a man of many secrets, and one of them was that a hunted man must know how to sew himself back together. I need isopropyl, a curved needle, and the silk thread from my sewing kit. Now, she barked at a stunned Kale. She ripped Sunu's shirt open. The wound was a jagged graze from a high-caliber round, not deep enough to hit the liver, but wide enough to bleed him dry if the tension wasn't held. As she pressed a wad of gauze into the tear, Sunu's hand flew up, gripping her wrist with bruising force. His eyes were blown wide, reflecting a vulnerability that didn't belong on a Han. Why, he managed to choke out. "I am your enemy, you're a patient," she countered, her eyes fixed on the wound. "And you're too valuable to let die on a rug," she worked with a terrifying, steady precision. The room went silent, the only sound the wet slide of the needle through skin. As she pulled the first stitch tight, Sunu's body arched, his forehead dropping against her shoulder. The physical barrier that had defined their Cold War vanished. For the first time, they weren't icons of rival dynasties, they were two bodies pressed together in the dark, one fighting to live, the other refusing to let go. The heat of his skin against hers was an electric shock. When the last knot was tied, Lindsay didn't pull away. She stayed there, supporting his weight as his breathing stabilized. Sunu's grip on her wrist softened, his thumb brushing against her pulse point in a gesture that felt dangerously like a caress. The monster was wounded, and the healer was the only one who knew where his heart beat. The transition from the velvet shadows of Milan to the rusted, skeletal remains of Gary, Indiana, felt like a descent into an industrial underworld. Sunu, still pale and moving with a stiff, guarded gait, leaned heavily on a cane as they stood before a row of corrugated steel doors. The humid Midwest air tasted of salt and old iron, a scent that lived in the back of Lindsay's throat like a memory of home. "My father called this his life insurance," Lindsay whispered, fitting a heavy, rusted key into the lock of Unit 402. "He said if the Hans ever finished what they started, the truth would burn the world down." The door shrieked open. Inside, the space was cramped, lined with mildewed filing cabinets and stacks of hard drives that looked like relics from another era. This was the nerve center Mitchell Park had built while in hiding, a tomb of data dedicated to the destruction of the Han dynasty. Sunu watched in silence as Lindsay pulled a thick, leather-bound ledger from a safe bolted to the floor. As she flipped the pages, the cold professional mask he wore began to crack. These weren't just financial records. They were manifests. Dates, weights, and inventory descriptions that were sickeningly human. The documents laid out a global network of human trafficking, an invisible web of misery that had funded the Han family's rise to power for 3 generations. The Palazzo Nero, the shipping lines, the tech conglomerates, all of it had been built on a foundation of souls sold in the dark. "It's not just my father's work," Lindsay said, her voice trembling as she held a photo of a young girl with hollow eyes, a shipping tag tied to her wrist. "These are your family's signatures, Sunu. Your uncle, your father, even your grandmother." Sunu took the ledger, his fingers trembling. The accent he had obsessed over, the voice that reminded him of a lost sanctuary, was suddenly tainted. The home he had been longing for was built on the screams of the people his ancestors had exploited. He looked at the lists of names, hundreds of them, and realized his entire identity was a curated lie. "I didn't know," he rasped, the words sounding hollow even to him. "Now you do," Lindsay replied, stepping closer, her eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and a strange, new pity. "The mark you put on me? That's nothing compared to the mark your family put on the world." The silence in the storage unit was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of the highway. The predator was no longer in control, he was a man standing in the wreckage of his own legacy. Staring at the woman who held the match, the news didn't come via a phone call, it came through a live feed on Kale's tablet, the flickering orange glow illuminating the cramped storage unit in Gary. Palazzo Nero, the architectural crown jewel of the Han Empire, was a pillar of fire. The elegant marble arches were collapsing under the weight of thermite charges, and the screams of the staff, Lindsay's only family for 3 years, were lost in the roar of the inferno. "The Beck family," Sunu whispered, his face a mask of frozen horror. "They found out I was weakened. They aren't just taking the territory, they're erasing the legacy." Lindsay watched the screen, her breath hitching as she recognized the service entrance where she had been fired only days ago. The co-workers who had shared their bread with her, the kitchen staff who had whispered jokes in the dark, they were being executed as they fled the heat. The Becks were leaving no witnesses. My friends are in there, Lindsay gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Sunu, you have to do something. Your security, your private forces, if I send them, Sunu interrupted, his voice cracking, it triggers a full-scale war. The syndicate board will vote to remove me the moment I prioritize a server's life over the preservation of the remaining assets. If I stay silent, I keep the chair. I keep the power. The choice was a jagged blade. On one side was the Han Syndicate, the massive, blood-stained machine he had spent his life preparing to lead. On the other was the human cost of that machine, laid bare in the burning ruins of a restaurant and the ledger of names in his hand. Lindsay grabbed his lapels, forcing him to look away from the screen. Look at me. You said I sounded like home. Is your home a graveyard? Is that what you want to be, the king of the ashes? Sunu looked at her, and for the first time, the Busan blade saw the steel in his eyes snap. The obsession that had started with a voice had evolved into a gut-wrenching realization. He couldn't be the man his father was. Kale, Sunu said, his voice regaining a deadly, focused calm. Burn the offshore accounts. Funnel the liquid assets into the private securities Black Ops fund. Tell them to ignore the vault. Tell them to save every soul left in that building. Sir, Kale hesitated, that's treason against the board. You'll be stripped of everything. You'll be a target. I'm already a target, Sunu said, looking at Lindsay with a tragic, haunting smile. I'd rather be a target with a conscience than a ghost in a palace. As the Palazzo Nero crumbled thousands of miles away, the power shifted. Sunu Han was no longer a titan. He was a man standing in a rusted shed in Indiana, finally ready to tear his own world down. The motel room on the outskirts of Gary was a mess of flickering monitors and crumpled maps. Sunu sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of his fallen empire bowing his shoulders, but Lindsay was a whirlwind of calculated motion. The Busan blade had finally unsheathed itself, and she wasn't cutting with insults anymore, she was cutting with data. They think you're a wounded animal, Sunu. That's their mistake, Lindsay said, her fingers flying across a laptop keyboard. The Becks think they've won because Palazzo Nero is gone, and your lieutenants think they can sell your head to the highest bidder to save their own seats. She pulled up a digital map of the Chicago shipping yards. My father didn't just collect names, he mapped the routes. The same routes the Becks are using right now to move the Han inventory they seized in the raid. They're greedy. They're moving the evidence themselves. Sunu looked up, a spark of the old predator returning to his eyes. You're going to leak the manifests, not to the police. Not yet. Lindsay corrected, a cold smile touching her lips. I'm sending the Beck family's internal coordinates to your traitorous lieutenants, telling them it's a peace offering from you. And I'm sending your lieutenants' bank records to the Becks, making it look like they've been skimming from the trafficking profits for years. It was a masterpiece of kinetic friction. By feeding both sides a cocktail of truth and tailored lies, she was turning the two most dangerous forces in the underworld into a pair of starving wolves locked in a small cage. When they meet at the docks tonight to negotiate, they won't be talking, she continued, her voice dropping into that sharp Busan dialect that commanded attention. They'll be looking for blood. And while they're busy tearing each other apart, we're going to trigger the final upload. Every file in that storage unit goes to the International Criminal Court and the global press simultaneously. Sunu stood up, walking over to stand behind her. He placed a hand on the back of her chair, his shadow falling over the screen. You're destroying my family's name forever. You realize that? There will be nothing left to inherit. I'm not destroying your name, Sunu, she said, turning to look at him. I'm cauterizing the wound. You can't be a king if you're sitting on a throne of corpses. For the first time since the night in Milan, the power dynamic was equalized. She wasn't his captive, and he wasn't her savior. They were two ghosts, armed with the truth, ready to burn the old world down to build something human from the smoke. The Chicago meatpacking district was a labyrinth of rusted iron and freezing fog. Inside the derelict warehouse, the air was heavy with the metallic tang of old blood and the ozone of high-tension wires. The plan had worked with brutal efficiency. The Beck enforcers and Sunu's traitorous lieutenants had decimated one another in a frantic shootout, leaving only the architect of the massacre standing. Victor Beck stood in the center of the kill floor, his breath hitching in the cold. He was reaching for a fallen pistol when a flash of silver cut through the dark. Lindsay didn't scream, she moved like a shadow, the small, serrated blade she had carried since Busan pressed firmly against the pulse point of his throat. "Don't move," she whispered in English, before sliding back into the sharp, rhythmic dialect of her father. "Every drop of blood spilled tonight belongs to you, Victor. But it ends here." Sunu emerged from the shadows, his face bruised and his gait slow, but his eyes were clear. He looked at Beck, the man who had burned Palazzo Nero, and then at Lindsay. The cycle was laid bare before them, a Park holding a knife to a Beck, fueled by the sins of a Han. "Kill him, Lindsay," Sunu said, his voice a low, hollow vibration. "He took your friends. He tried to take your life. If you don't cut the thread, he'll just come back." Lindsay's hand trembled. The blade bit just deep enough into Beck's skin to draw a single, bright bead of red. She could feel the man's terror, the frantic beat of a heart that had never valued the lives of others. For a moment, the ghost of Mitchell Park stood behind her, whispering for blood. Then, she looked at Sunu. She saw the man who had chosen a conscience over a throne, and she realized that if she pushed that blade home, she would become exactly what the Hans and Parks had been for generations, a monster in a tailored suit. "No," Lindsay said, her voice steady and resonant. She pulled the knife away and stepped back. "What are you doing?" Beck gasped, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I'm giving you to the world," she replied. On the wall behind them, a series of monitors flickered to life. The upload was complete. The manifests, the bank accounts, and the live audio of the night's confession were already hitting the servers of every major news outlet and federal agency. Sirens wailed in the distance, not the private security of a syndicate, but the authorities. "If I kill you, I stay in your world," Lindsay said, looking at Sunu as she dropped the knife onto the concrete floor. "I'm tired of the dark, Sunu. I'm going home." She turned and walked toward the exit, not looking back at the ruins or the riches. Sunu hesitated for only a second before following her, leaving the legacy of the Hans behind in the cold Chicago night. The Busan blade had finally found its peace, not through blood, but through the courage to walk away. 1 year later, the Palazzo Nero did not smell of smoke or secrets. It smelled of fresh jasmine and the crisp, clean scent of the Mediterranean breeze. The scorched marble had been replaced with warm, sustainable wood, and the heavy velvet curtains had been stripped away to let in the Italian sun. It was no longer a fortress for the elite, it was a sanctuary. The upper floors now housed the Parkhan Foundation, a global initiative providing legal aid and education for those displaced by the very trafficking networks Sunu and Lindsay had dismantled. Sunu stood at the far end of the dining room, his suit charcoal gray and his expression softer than the sharp-edged titan who had once sat there in silence. He wasn't at the head of a long boardroom table. He was standing by table 9, the same spot where a server had once shattered his world with a few sharp words. "You're late for your reservation," Sunu said as Lindsay entered. She wasn't wearing a uniform. She wore a simple, elegant dress the color of the Busan Sea, her eyes bright with the peace she had fought so hard to earn. "I had to oversee the installation in the foyer," she replied, walking toward him. They both turned to look through the open doors. In the center of the grand entrance sat a modest bronze plaque. It didn't boast of wealth or power. It bore the name Mitchell Park and the inscription, "To the man who kept the truth until it could be heard." A hero is not defined by his shadow, but by the light he leaves behind. Sunu turned back to her, his hand reaching for hers. The touch was no longer desperate or possessive, it was an anchor. "The board of the foundation wants to expand to Seoul next month," Sunu murmured, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "But I realized I don't want to go anywhere, not to Korea, not even to the next room, unless you're there to tell me when I'm being in Napunseki." Lindsay laughed, the sound bright and clear, filling the room where silence used to reign. Sunu sank to one knee, the movement fluid and humble. He produced a ring, not a diamond of ostentatious size, but a band of hammered gold set with a single, deep blue sapphire, the color of deep water. "I spent my life collecting things to fill a void," he said, looking up at her. "But you gave me a voice. You gave me a soul. Lindsay Park, will you build a new legacy with me?" One that belongs only to us? Lindsay looked at the man who had been her captor, then her ally, and finally her equal. She leaned down, whispering her answer in the sharp, beautiful dialect of the Busan docks, a promise that would echo through the halls of the new Palazzo Nero for a lifetime. Yes, she whispered. Let's go home. From the gilded cages of Milan to the secrets of Gary, Indiana, Lindsay and Sunu's story shows that no legacy is too broken to be rebuilt. If you enjoyed this journey of revenge turned to redemption, make sure to smash that like button. It helps the Stories with Noni reach more viewers. To never miss a chapter of our upcoming series, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. I have a brand new story starting next week that you won't want to miss. Finally, I want to hear from you. Do you think Sunu truly deserved Lindsay's forgiveness? Let me know in the comments below.